The courtroom fell silent as the judge's gavel struck wood 3 times. Marcus Chén stood frozen behind the defense table, his hands trembling against the polished surface. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, held a folded piece of paper that contained the next 30 years of his life. We, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Chén guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus felt his knees buckle, caught only by his attorney's quick reflexes. Behind him, his elderly mother collapsed into her seat, her wails filling the sterile air of the courtroom. The prosecution team exchanged satisfied glances while cameras flashed from the media section. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been a successful software entrepreneur, running a thriving tech startup with his business partner, Daniel Walsh. They had built the company from nothing, 2 college friends who shared a dream and turned it into a $7 million enterprise. But on the night of March 15th, everything shattered. Daniel disappeared. His car was found abandoned in the parking garage beneath their office building. The driver's side door hung open. Blood, lots of it, pooled on the concrete floor and streaked across the door panel. Forensic analysts estimated 2 pints worth, enough to indicate severe trauma. But no body was ever recovered. The investigation moved with terrifying speed. Detectives discovered that Marcus and Daniel had been arguing for months about the company's direction. Employees testified about heated exchanges behind closed doors. The financial records revealed that Daniel wanted to sell the company to a larger corporation, while Marcus refused, unwilling to give up control of what they had created. Then came the evidence that sealed Marcus's fate. Security footage from the parking garage had been mysteriously corrupted for the crucial hours between 8 and 11 p.m. Marcus claimed he had left the office at 6:30, gone home to his wife Jennifer, and spent the evening watching television. But Jennifer's testimony seemed strangely rehearsed, her eyes never quite meeting the prosecutor's gaze when she confirmed his alibi. The prosecution painted a damning picture. Marcus, desperate to maintain control of the company, had lured Daniel to the parking garage and attacked him. The missing body was simply proof of premeditation. Marcus had planned the disposal carefully, perhaps using his engineering background to calculate the perfect method. The blood evidence proved violence. The business motive proved reason. The corrupted footage proved opportunity. Marcus's attorney, a court-appointed defender named Robert Hayes, did his best. He pointed out the absence of a murder weapon, the lack of any physical evidence tying Marcus to the scene during those missing hours, the impossibility of moving a body from a busy downtown parking garage without witnesses. But the prosecution had an answer for everything. Their star witness was Dr. Patricia Morrison, a forensic blood pattern analyst with 20 years of experience. She testified with absolute certainty that the blood distribution indicated a violent struggle and fatal blood loss. She explained how the arterial spray patterns proved Daniel had suffered catastrophic injury. Her confident demeanor and impressive credentials swayed the jury in ways that Robert's cross-examination could never undo. The evidence is clear, Dr. Morrison had stated from the witness stand, her voice carrying the weight of scientific authority. Daniel Walsh lost enough blood in that garage to cause death. The patterns indicate he was conscious and fighting during the attack. This was not an accident. This was murder. If you're shocked by how fast an innocent life can be destroyed, hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. You're about to witness one of the most incredible miscarriages of justice ever documented, and you won't believe how it finally gets exposed. Now Marcus stood in shackles as the bailiff approached to lead him away. He turned one last time to look at his mother, at the empty seat where Jennifer should have been but wasn't. His wife had stopped attending the trial after the first week, claiming the stress was too much. He had accepted it then, grateful that she wouldn't have to endure the brutal testimony. Now, seeing that empty chair, something cold settled in his stomach. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life. The state seized his assets to cover court costs and restitution to Daniel's family. The company was sold at auction. Everything Marcus had built, every dream he had cherished, vanished into the machinery of justice. Greenfield Correctional Facility became his new reality. The gray walls, the constant noise, the suffocating routine of incarceration. Marcus maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen, but after the first year, people stopped listening. The prison counselor suggested he accept responsibility as a first step toward rehabilitation. Other inmates saw his refusal to admit guilt as arrogance. He wrote letters to Jennifer every week for the first 6 months. She never responded. When he finally received mail, it was divorce papers. She had already moved out of their home, relocated to an undisclosed address, and wanted nothing more to do with him. The papers cited irreconcilable differences. Marcus signed them with a pen that barely worked, his signature shaky and defeated. Years crawled past with the speed of geological time. Marcus worked in the prison library, keeping his head down, avoiding trouble. He filed appeals that went nowhere. Robert Hayes had done his best, but court-appointed attorneys rarely have the resources for extensive appeals work. Every legal avenue led to a dead end. The conviction was solid. The evidence was strong. The system had spoken. His mother visited once a month until her health failed. In year 7, she passed away from a stroke, and Marcus wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. He stood in his cell while they buried her, staring at the small photograph he kept tucked in his Bible, the only personal item he was permitted. By year 10, Marcus had resigned himself to dying in prison. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had maintained his innocence so long that even he sometimes wondered if his memory was faulty, if perhaps he had blocked out what really happened that night. The human mind, he learned, could be its own worst enemy. But God, as Marcus would later testify, works in mysterious ways. Father Miguel Santos had spent 15 years as a missionary in the remote mountain villages of Bolivia. He worked with indigenous communities, building schools, teaching agriculture techniques, and spreading the gospel to people who lived 3 days' journey from the nearest paved road. It was hard work, spiritually rewarding but physically exhausting. At 62 years old, he wondered how many more years he could maintain this pace. In March of the 15th year, Father Miguel traveled to a village called San Rafael del Monte, accessible only by a combination of bus, mule, and hiking. The village consisted of maybe 40 families, subsistence farmers who grew potatoes and quinoa on terraced hillsides that had been cultivated the same way for centuries. They lived without electricity, without internet, without any connection to the modern world that existed in the valleys below. Father Miguel loved these communities precisely because of their simplicity. Here, faith was practiced without distraction, and human relationships maintained an authenticity that cities had long ago abandoned. He spent a week in San Rafael del Monte, conducting services, blessing homes, and helping repair the roof of their small chapel. On his last day, as the villagers gathered for a farewell meal, Father Miguel pulled out his smartphone to take photographs. It was a small indulgence, a way to document his work for the church newsletter and for his own memory. He was not a sophisticated photographer. He simply pointed and clicked, capturing images of smiling children, weathered farmers, the stunning mountain landscape that surrounded them. In one photograph, he captured the village square during the afternoon meal. Long wooden tables had been arranged in the open air, and villagers sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing food and conversation. Father Miguel focused on an elderly woman in traditional dress, her face creased with laughter as she spoke with her grandchildren. He never noticed the couple sitting at a table in the background, partially obscured by other villagers. A man with a thick beard and sun-weathered skin, wearing the simple clothes of a mountain farmer. Beside him, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her face turned slightly away from the camera. They looked like any other couple in San Rafael del Monte, unremarkable and forgotten. Father Miguel returned to his mission headquarters in La Paz 2 weeks later. There, he finally had reliable internet access and began uploading his photographs to the church's website and his personal social media accounts. He wrote captions in Spanish and English, describing his experiences, praising the faith and resilience of the mountain communities. The photograph from San Rafael del Monte was titled, "Fellowship and Faith in the Andes." It received a handful of likes from other missionaries and church members. Father Miguel thought nothing more of it and moved on to planning his next journey. But the internet has a strange power, an ability to connect dots that should never have been connected. algorithms designed to recognize faces, to suggest tags, to link photographs across platforms. And sometimes those algorithms reveal truths that were meant to stay buried. Sarah Chén, Marcus's younger sister, had never stopped believing in her brother's innocence. While others moved on, while even their mother had eventually accepted a quiet despair, Sarah had remained obstinate. She worked as a paralegal in Seattle, and she spent her free time combing through the case files, searching for anything that might have been missed. She also spent time online, following true crime forums, joining groups dedicated to wrongful convictions. She posted about Marcus's case regularly, sharing his photograph, explaining the circumstances of his conviction, begging for anyone who might have information to come forward. Most posts received sympathy but no actionable leads. Sarah had also set up a sophisticated system of Google alerts and facial recognition searches. Any photograph uploaded to public websites that might match Daniel Walsh's face would trigger a notification to her email. It was a long shot, a desperate measure that she knew would probably yield nothing. Daniel was dead. The blood evidence proved it. Dr. Morrison had testified to it. But Sarah had learned something important during her years of amateur investigation. She had learned that experts could be wrong, that confident testimony was not the same as truth, that the criminal justice system, despite its noble intentions, was operated by fallible human beings who made mistakes. On a Tuesday morning in April, 15 years after her brother's conviction, Sarah received an email notification that made her spill coffee across her desk. The facial recognition software had flagged a match. Confidence level 78%. The image came from a missionary's photograph, uploaded to a church website, taken in a village in Bolivia called San Rafael del Monte. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the image file. The photograph was innocuous at first glance, showing villagers gathered for a meal. But the software had highlighted a face in the background, partially turned away from the camera but visible enough for analysis. She zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as her basic photo software would allow. The man had a beard, much fuller than Daniel had ever worn. His skin was darker, weathered by sun and altitude. His hair was longer, streaked with gray. But the structure of his face, the set of his eyes, the distinctive shape of his nose. Sarah had studied Daniel Walsh's photographs for 15 years. She knew every angle of his face, her breath caught in her throat. Sitting beside the bearded man was a woman. Sarah zoomed in on her face, and the coffee-stained desk was forgotten entirely. Jennifer Chén, Marcus's ex-wife. The woman who had provided his alibi and then divorced him during his first year in prison. The woman who had disappeared completely from public life, leaving no forwarding address, no social media presence, no trace. Sarah sat frozen for 10 minutes, staring at the screen, her legal training warring with her emotional response. This could be a coincidence. The facial recognition software was not infallible. 78% confidence meant there was a 22% chance of error. People had doppelgangers. The world was full of individuals who resembled each other. But two doppelgangers together, in a remote Bolivian village? Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén both matching, both in the same photograph, 15 years after Daniel's supposed murder and Jennifer's disappearance? Sarah reached for her phone with trembling fingers. She needed to call Robert Hayes, Marcus's original attorney. She needed to verify the image, to have it professionally analyzed. She needed to move carefully because if this was real, if this photograph showed what she thought it showed, then her brother had spent 15 years in prison for a crime that never happened. And if the crime never happened, then someone had committed fraud on a massive scale. Someone had staged a murder scene, complete with blood evidence that fooled forensic experts. Someone had stolen $7 million worth of company assets. Someone had deliberately destroyed Marcus Chén's life and walked away clean. Sarah downloaded the image and saved multiple copies to different locations. Then she began making phone calls. The first was to Robert Hayes. The second was to every journalist contact she had accumulated over 15 years of advocacy. The third was to a private forensic analyst who specialized in digital image authentication. By evening, The photograph had been shared to 3 true crime forums and 2 Reddit communities dedicated to wrongful convictions. Sarah wrote detailed posts explaining the context, providing photographs of Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén from before the disappearance, and asking for help in verifying the identities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, amateur sleuths were enhancing the image, comparing facial features, creating side-by-side analyses. Someone located Father Miguel's contact information and reached out to him, asking for the original uncompressed photograph file. Another person began mapping the location of San Rafael del Monte, calculating how someone might have reached such a remote village. By midnight, the photograph had been shared over 10,000 times. By morning, it was trending on Twitter with the hashtag wrongful conviction. By noon, local news stations in Seattle and San Francisco were running segments about Marcus Chén's case and the mysterious photograph from Bolivia. Robert Hayes received Sarah's call while sitting in evening traffic on the San Francisco Bay Bridge. He was 61 years old now, tired, and counting down the years until retirement. He had spent 4 decades as a public defender, handling hundreds of cases, winning some, losing most. Marcus Chén's case had haunted him more than others. The evidence had seemed so strong, yet something about Marcus's desperate protestations of innocence had rung true in ways that guilty clients' denials never did. When Sarah explained what she had found, Robert nearly rear-ended the car in front of him. He pulled over at the first opportunity, emergency flashers blinking, and made Sarah send him the image immediately. He stared at it on his phone screen, his attorney's skepticism warring with a rising sense of shock. "I need the original file," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need authentication. I need to know this isn't doctored." "I'm working on it," Sarah replied. "Father Miguel is cooperating fully. He's sending the original raw file from his camera. I've also hired a forensic digital analyst to verify it hasn't been manipulated." Robert's mind was already racing through legal implications. If this photograph was genuine, it would prove actual innocence, the highest standard for overturning a conviction. But he would need more than a photograph. He would need definitive proof that the man in the image was Daniel Walsh. He would need to explain how Daniel had faked his death. He would need to answer the question of the blood evidence. The blood evidence. Dr. Patricia Morrison's testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. She had testified that the blood loss was fatal, that the patterns indicated violent trauma. How could that be reconciled with Daniel Walsh alive and well in Bolivia? Robert called his former colleague Linda Martinez, who now worked for the Innocence Project. Within an hour, they were on a conference call with Sarah, reviewing the photograph and discussing strategy. "We need to move fast but carefully," Linda advised. "If this gets to Daniel Walsh before we can secure additional evidence, he'll disappear again. We need to find out everything we can about how he's living in Bolivia, what name he's using, whether there are any official records. And we need to challenge the original blood evidence," Robert added. "If Daniel is alive, then either the blood wasn't his, or the analysis of the blood loss was wrong." "Can we request DNA testing on the original samples?" Sarah asked. "After 15 years, I doubt there's much left," Linda said. "But we can try. More importantly, we need to find out whose blood it was if it wasn't Daniel's." The forensic digital analyst, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Wong, completed her authentication within 48 hours. The image was genuine, unaltered, taken on the date and time stamped in the metadata. The camera's GPS coordinates confirmed the location as San Rafael del Monte, Bolivia. There was no evidence of manipulation, no signs of digital forgery. Meanwhile, amateur internet sleuths were conducting their own investigation. Someone located records showing that Jennifer Chén had closed all her U.S. bank accounts 2 weeks after Marcus's arrest. Another person found evidence that she had sold her car for cash to a private buyer. There was no record of her leaving the country under her own name, but several people noted that fake passports were not difficult to obtain for someone with sufficient motivation and money. A linguistics expert analyzed Father Miguel's photograph more carefully and identified a small detail that others had missed. On the wooden table in front of the bearded man was a book, its cover partially visible. Someone enhanced the image and identified it as a Spanish-language Bible, the kind distributed by Catholic missions. But there was an inscription on the cover, barely legible even with enhancement. Para Daniel, con amor, Jennifer. For Daniel, with love, Jennifer. The internet erupted. The photograph was now being shared hundreds of thousands of times. News organizations were scrambling to cover the story. Marcus Chén's wrongful conviction was becoming a national sensation. Father Miguel, suddenly thrust into the center of a criminal investigation, provided everything he could remember about the couple. They had arrived in San Rafael del Monte about 10 years ago, he estimated, though he couldn't be certain. They introduced themselves as David and Julia Martinez, aid workers from Spain who had fallen in love with Bolivia and decided to stay. They lived simply, farming a small plot of land, occasionally helping with community projects. They were friendly but private, never sharing much about their past. Father Miguel had thought nothing of their presence. Foreign aid workers and missionaries often settled in remote communities. The villages welcomed anyone willing to work hard and integrate respectfully into local life. But now, looking back, Father Miguel remembered small details that seemed significant. David spoke Spanish with an American accent, not Spanish. Julia rarely spoke at all, as if afraid her voice might betray something. They paid for everything in cash, never using credit cards or banks. And once, when Father Miguel had mentioned taking photographs, he had noticed Julia turning her face away from the camera. Robert Hayes filed an emergency motion with the California Court of Appeals, requesting an immediate stay of Marcus Chén's sentence and a full evidentiary hearing. He attached the authenticated photograph, the expert analyses, and sworn affidavits from multiple sources. He argued that new evidence had emerged that fundamentally undermined the conviction and demonstrated actual innocence. The motion landed on the desk of Judge Patricia Rollins, a veteran of the appellate court with a reputation for thoroughness. She read through the filing with increasing astonishment. Then she did something unusual. Instead of following normal procedure and scheduling a hearing for several months in the future, she issued an emergency order within 72 hours. Marcus Chén was to be released on his own recognizance pending a full evidentiary hearing. The state of California was ordered to preserve all evidence from the original trial, particularly the blood samples. The district attorney's office was directed to cooperate fully with an independent investigation into the new evidence. And Judge Rollins ordered U.S. authorities to coordinate with Bolivian law enforcement to locate and detain David and Julia Martinez of San Rafael del Monte for questioning in connection with fraud and conspiracy charges. Marcus Chén walked out of Greenfield Correctional Facility on a Wednesday morning in late April. He had been incarcerated for 15 years, 2 months, and 17 days. He was 49 years old, gray at the temples, his face lined with the weight of lost time. His sister Sarah waited for him at the gate, tears streaming down her face. They embraced in silence. Words seemed inadequate to the moment. Marcus had spent 15 years believing he would die in prison, believing that justice was a concept that existed in theory but not in practice, believing that God had abandoned him to a fate he didn't deserve. The media circus was immediate and overwhelming. News vans lined the road outside the prison. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. Robert Hayes and Linda Martinez formed a protective barrier, shepherding Marcus toward a waiting car while declining to comment beyond a prepared statement. Marcus moved through it all in a daze. The world had changed in 15 years. Smartphones were everywhere. Social media had become the primary means of communication. Self-driving cars were being tested on public roads. The technology startup he and Daniel had founded seemed quaint by comparison to what now existed. They drove to a safe house that the Innocence Project had arranged, a small apartment where Marcus could decompress away from media attention. Sarah stayed with him. For the first few hours, they simply sat together, not speaking, adjusting to the reality that they were in the same room again as free people. Eventually, Sarah showed him everything: the photograph, the online investigation, the authentication reports, the timeline of how his case had suddenly gone viral and forced the legal system to act. Marcus stared at the image of Daniel and Jennifer sitting at that table in Bolivia. His hands trembled. Sarah watched him carefully, worried about how he would process the betrayal. "I trusted them," Marcus finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Both of them. Daniel was like my brother. Jennifer was my wife. I built my life around them. And they did this." The rage came later, a volcanic eruption of emotion that Marcus had suppressed for 15 years. He threw a chair across the room, shouted until his voice gave out, collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Sarah held him while he broke, let him purge the poison that had accumulated in his soul. When the storm passed, Marcus felt hollow, but somehow cleaner. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had been acknowledged, validated, released into the world instead of festering inside him. Meanwhile, across the world, Bolivian authorities were moving on Judge Rollins's request. A special police unit from La Paz traveled to San Rafael del Monte, a journey that took 2 days by vehicle and then on foot. They brought with them photographs of Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén, documentation from the California court, and an interpreter who spoke both Spanish and the local indigenous language. The village received them warily. The people of San Rafael del Monte had little reason to trust government authorities. Police and soldiers had historically brought trouble, not help. But Father Miguel vouched for the officers, explained that they were seeking information about a serious crime, and asked the villagers to cooperate. David and Julia Martinez, the police learned, had left San Rafael del Monte approximately 1 week earlier. The timing coincided suspiciously with when the photograph had first started circulating online. Several villagers confirmed that David had suddenly become anxious, checking a smartphone that no one had known he possessed, speaking urgently with Julia in English rather than Spanish. They had departed quickly, taking only what they could carry, leaving behind most of their possessions and their small farmhouse. They told no one where they were going. They simply disappeared into the mountains, heading in the direction of the border with Peru. The Bolivian police issued an alert to all border crossings, airports, and bus stations. They provided photographs and descriptions. But Bolivia is a large country with porous borders and many places to disappear. If Daniel and Jennifer had planned an escape route, if they had money and forged documents, they could evade capture indefinitely. Back in California, the district attorney's office was in crisis mode. The prosecutor who had handled Marcus Chén's case, Thomas Brennan, had retired 5 years earlier. But the current DA, Michelle Santos, knew that this case could define her career. If it was proven that Marcus Chén had been wrongfully convicted based on flawed evidence, the fallout would be enormous. Michelle assigned her best investigator, a former FBI agent named Frank Morrison, to review every aspect of the original case. She needed to know how this had happened, how a supposedly ironclad murder conviction could be based on a crime that never occurred. Frank started with the blood evidence. He located Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic blood pattern analyst who had testified at trial. She was now 72 years old, living in retirement in Sacramento. When Frank called to request an interview, she initially declined, insisting that her testimony had been accurate and scientifically sound. But when Frank explained about the photograph from Bolivia, about Daniel Walsh apparently being alive, Dr. Morrison went silent for a long moment. Then she agreed to meet. They sat in her kitchen, a sunny room decorated with photographs of grandchildren. Dr. Morrison made tea with shaking hands while Frank laid out the evidence. The photograph, the authentication reports, the timeline of events. "I don't understand," Dr. Morrison said finally. "The blood was real. The volume was significant. The patterns indicated trauma. I've analyzed thousands of crime scenes. I know what fatal blood loss looks like." "Could someone have faked it?" Frank asked gently. Dr. Morrison considered the question seriously. "To fake blood evidence convincingly, you would need real blood. You would need a significant quantity, at least 2 pints. You would need to understand blood pattern analysis well enough to create patterns that looked authentic to an expert. How would someone get that much blood? Blood banks, medical facilities, You could donate your own blood over time and store it. It's not impossible, just difficult and requires planning. She paused, her face troubled. But I analyzed that blood. I testified that it came from Daniel Walsh. Did you actually perform DNA testing? Dr. Morrison looked stricken. No. The prosecution didn't request it. They said it was unnecessary because there was no doubt about whose blood it was. Daniel's car, Daniel's parking space, Daniel missing. They assumed it was his blood, and I was only asked to analyze the patterns, not the identity. Frank made notes, his expression carefully neutral. This was the crack in the case, the point where assumptions had replaced verification. The prosecution had been so confident of their narrative that they had skipped a crucial step. Dr. Morrison, Frank said carefully, is it possible that you were wrong about the blood loss being fatal? She met his eyes and he saw genuine anguish there. Blood pattern analysis is not an exact science. We interpret what we see based on experience and training, but interpretation can be wrong. If I was told that this was a murder scene, that a man was missing and presumed dead, then I would interpret ambiguous patterns as supporting that theory. It's called confirmation bias, and it's one of the greatest dangers in forensic science. Frank left Dr. Morrison's house with a heavy heart. She was not a villain. She was a dedicated professional who had done her job based on the information provided to her. But her testimony had helped send an innocent man to prison for 15 years. The district attorney's office had stored the original blood evidence in a secure facility, frozen and preserved according to protocol. Frank Morrison obtained a court order to conduct full DNA analysis on the samples. The testing was performed by an independent laboratory that specialized in forensic genetics, using technology that hadn't existed 15 years ago. The results came back 3 weeks later. Frank read the report twice, then immediately called Michelle Santos. The blood is Daniel Walsh's, he said without preamble. DNA confirms it. But there's something else. The blood contains preservatives, the kind used in blood storage facilities. This wasn't fresh blood from an injury. This was stored blood that had been poured at the crime scene. Michelle closed her eyes, the full scope of the deception becoming clear. He donated his own blood over time. Probably over several months. You can safely donate every 8 weeks. If Daniel Walsh had been planning this for 6 months or more, he could have accumulated enough blood to stage a convincing crime scene. Why would someone go through such elaborate planning? Frank had spent the past 3 weeks reconstructing the timeline. Money and freedom. If Daniel Walsh disappeared and was presumed dead, he would never face consequences for embezzling from the company. And if Marcus Chén went to prison for murder, he couldn't contest the dissolution of the business or the distribution of assets. Michelle pulled up the financial records from the original case. When the company had been sold at auction during Marcus's trial, the proceeds had been distributed according to the partnership agreement. 50% went to pay legal fees, court costs, and restitution. The remaining 50% had been placed in a trust for Daniel Walsh's estate, to be managed by his designated beneficiary. His designated beneficiary was his sister, Emily Walsh. Except that a little digging revealed that Emily Walsh had never existed. The identity was fake, created with forged documents years before Daniel's disappearance. The trust account had been emptied within 6 months of Marcus's conviction. The money transferred through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts that eventually disappeared into untraceable channels. Jennifer Chén, Frank said. She must have been Emily Walsh. She collected the money and took it with her to Bolivia. The conspiracy had been meticulous. Daniel and Jennifer had likely been planning it for years, possibly from before Daniel and Marcus had even started their company. They had seen an opportunity to build something valuable and then steal it entirely, framing Marcus for murder in the process. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the power of social media, the permanence of digital images, and the determination of one sister who refused to stop believing in her brother's innocence. As news of the DNA findings became public, the story reached a new level of national attention. Marcus Chén became the face of wrongful conviction, appearing on news programs, giving interviews, telling his story with quiet dignity that made the injustice even more powerful. Legal experts began discussing the broader implications. How many other cases relied on forensic testimony that was presented with certainty, but was actually based on interpretive judgment? How many experts suffered from confirmation bias, seeing evidence through the lens of what they expected to find rather than what actually existed? The state's Criminal Justice Reform Commission opened an investigation into Dr. Patricia Morrison's other cases. They reviewed every case where she had testified about blood pattern analysis, looking for other potential errors. Dr. Morrison cooperated fully, visibly devastated by the realization that her testimony might have contributed to other wrongful convictions. Marcus, watching this unfold from his apartment, felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, relief that the truth had finally emerged, but also a deep, abiding sadness for the lost years that could never be recovered. His mother had died believing her son was a murderer. That knowledge haunted him. She had visited him faithfully for 7 years, never missing a monthly visit, but he had seen the doubt in her eyes. She had loved him, but she had also wondered if perhaps there was some truth to the conviction. Now she would never know that he had been innocent all along. Sarah arranged for Marcus to meet with a trauma counselor who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. The psychological damage of long-term incarceration was profound and lasting. Marcus had spent 15 years in an environment where violence was common, where trust was dangerous, where every day required constant vigilance. Those patterns didn't disappear simply because he walked out of the prison gates. He struggled with ordinary tasks. Choosing what to eat from a restaurant menu paralyzed him with anxiety. Walking down a crowded street made him hyperventilate. The simple freedom of closing a door and being alone in a room felt overwhelming. The counselor explained that these reactions were normal, that his brain had adapted to survive in an abnormal environment, and that readjustment would take time. Some wrongfully convicted individuals never fully recovered. The psychological scars were too deep, the lost years too painful to process. But Marcus had something that sustained him. His faith, which he had maintained through 15 years of darkness, had been vindicated. He had prayed every day for truth to emerge, and truth had emerged. He had believed that God would not abandon the innocent, and God had sent a missionary with a camera to a remote village at exactly the right moment. Meanwhile, the international manhunt for Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén continued. Interpol issued red notices. The FBI added them to their most wanted list. Their photographs appeared on news broadcasts across Latin America. The reward for information leading to their capture grew to $100,000. In Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts. But Daniel and Jennifer had a significant head start, and they had planned for contingencies. They might have had multiple escape plans, multiple identities, money stashed in multiple locations. Some investigators believed they had fled to Europe, where they could disappear into larger populations and weaker border controls. Others thought they had gone deeper into the Amazon basin, where vast, uninhabited regions offered perfect hiding places. Still others speculated that they had plastic surgery and were living openly somewhere under completely new identities. Frank Morrison, however, had a different theory. He believed that Jennifer, having lived comfortably in San Rafael del Monte for a decade, would resist returning to a life on the run. She had grown accustomed to stability, to a community, to the simple pleasures of a quiet life. If they had fled, it was likely to somewhere similar, another remote community where foreigners could integrate without attracting attention. He focused his investigation on mission communities throughout South America, places where English-speaking foreigners wouldn't be unusual, where cash economies predominated, where modern surveillance was minimal. There were hundreds of such communities, but Frank was patient and methodical. 3 months after the photograph went viral, a nun named Sister Maria Gonzalez was working at a small medical clinic in the Pantanal region of Brazil, near the border with Bolivia. The clinic served indigenous communities and subsistence farmers scattered across the wetlands, providing basic medical care and health education. A couple arrived at the clinic one afternoon, requesting treatment for the man's infected foot wound. The nun, who had trained as a nurse before taking her vows, cleaned and bandaged the wound while making small talk in Spanish. The couple identified themselves as Thomas and Rachel Porter, American missionaries who ran a small agricultural project about 2 days' travel to the north. Sister Maria noticed that the woman, Rachel, seemed nervous. She kept glancing at the door, rarely making eye contact, and her hands trembled slightly when she handed over payment for the medical services. The man, Thomas, had an air of forced casualness that felt rehearsed. After they left, Sister Maria felt troubled by the interaction. Something about the couple had set off alarm bells, though she couldn't identify exactly what. She mentioned it to Father Carlos, the priest who oversaw the clinic, and he suggested she might simply be tired. They saw many patients each day, and not everyone who seemed nervous was hiding something sinister. But that night, Sister Maria couldn't sleep. She found herself thinking about the couple, about the woman's frightened eyes, about the man's too perfect smile. On impulse, she opened her laptop and searched the internet for recent news. The photograph from San Rafael del Monte appeared within minutes. Sister Maria stared at the images of Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén, comparing them mentally to Thomas and Rachel Porter. The man's beard was different, shorter. The woman's hair was cut differently. But the eyes, the facial structure, the subtle mannerisms. She immediately called Father Carlos. Within hours, they had contacted Brazilian federal police. Within a day, a tactical unit had been deployed to the region. Within 2 days, they had located the agricultural project where Thomas and Rachel Porter supposedly worked. It was actually an abandoned homestead, maintained just well enough to appear inhabited but clearly not a real residence. Local farmers reported that the American couple had arrived about 6 weeks earlier, kept to themselves, and seemed to have money despite not actually running any agricultural project. The police set up surveillance and waited. On the 3rd day, Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén returned to the homestead in a small boat, carrying supplies from a town 3 hours downriver. They were arrested without incident as they tied up the boat at a rickety dock. The arrest made international headlines within hours. Marcus Chén learned about it from a phone call from Robert Hayes, who could barely contain his excitement. Sarah cried. Linda Martinez from the Innocence Project sent a champagne bottle with a note. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Daniel Walsh and Jennifer Chén were extradited to the United States to face charges of fraud, conspiracy, perjury, and theft. The Brazilian authorities were efficient and the suspects had no grounds to fight extradition. Within a month, they were back on American soil, housed in separate detention facilities while awaiting trial. Marcus requested and received permission to observe Daniel's arraignment. He sat in the courtroom's public gallery, watching as his former friend was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Daniel's eyes scanned the room and locked onto Marcus for a brief moment. Neither man spoke, but volumes passed between them in that glance. Daniel pleaded not guilty and requested a public defender, claiming he had no financial resources. The irony was not lost on anyone present. He had stolen millions and now claimed poverty. Jennifer, housed separately, received a visit from an attorney that Marcus had arranged to offer her a deal. Testify fully and truthfully about the conspiracy, and the district attorney would recommend a reduced sentence, refuse, and face the maximum penalties for every charge. She accepted the deal within 48 hours. Jennifer's testimony, given in a series of depositions over several weeks, revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. She and Daniel had been in a romantic relationship for 2 years before Daniel and Marcus started their company. The relationship had been secret because Jennifer was dating Marcus at the time, and Daniel was engaged to someone else. As the company grew successful, Daniel had proposed the scheme. They would frame Marcus for Daniel's murder, steal the company's value, and disappear to start a new life together. Jennifer had been reluctant at first, troubled by the cruelty of the plan. But Daniel had convinced her that Marcus would receive a light sentence, maybe a few years, and would ultimately be fine. He told me the evidence would be circumstantial, Jennifer testified, tears streaming down her face. He said Marcus would probably get convicted of manslaughter, serve maybe 5 years, and then move on with his life. I never thought it would be 25 years to life. I never thought... She broke down completely, unable to continue. The prosecutor waited patiently for her to compose herself. The blood collection had taken 8 months. Daniel had donated blood regularly at different facilities under different names, always paying in cash, storing the blood in a medical-grade refrigerator he had purchased. He had studied blood pattern analysis, reading textbooks and watching videos, practicing until he could create convincing spatter patterns. On the night of the staged murder, Daniel had gone to the parking garage early. Jennifer had tampered with the security system, using access codes she had obtained during a Christmas party when she had flirted with the building's security manager and borrowed his tablet briefly. She had corrupted the footage for the crucial hours, making it appear as a technical glitch. Daniel had poured his stored blood across his car in the parking garage floor, creating patterns that looked like violent trauma. He had scattered his belongings to suggest a struggle. Then he had walked out of the garage, met Jennifer 2 blocks away, and they had driven through the night to Mexico. From Mexico, using forged passports, they had flown to Argentina, then made their way overland to Bolivia. The money from the company's liquidation had reached them through the fake Emily Walsh identity. They had lived comfortably for a decade, believing they were safe, believing no one would ever find them. "Why did you stay in San Rafael del Monte?" the prosecutor asked. "You had money. You could have gone anywhere." Jennifer looked haunted. "We were happy there. It sounds insane, but we were. We had a simple life, a good life. We thought we were far enough away that no one would ever connect us to anything. And after 10 years, we started to believe our own story. We became David and Julia. We almost forgot who we had been before." Marcus listened to the testimony through a video feed that Robert Hayes arranged. He felt numb. The depth of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. These people had stolen 15 years of his life for money and their relationship. They had destroyed his mother's final years. They had taken everything from him with casual cruelty. But listening to Jennifer break down, Marcus also felt something unexpected: pity. She had made a monstrous choice, but she was clearly destroyed by guilt. She had lived in fear for 15 years, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for discovery. Her paradise had been a prison of its own kind. Daniel Walsh, by contrast, showed no remorse. His attorney mounted a defense based on technicalities, arguing that since no one had actually died, he couldn't be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, only fraud and theft. The argument was legally creative, but morally bankrupt. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Daniel Walsh was convicted on all counts. Jennifer Chén, having cooperated with prosecution, received a reduced sentence, but still faced 12 years in federal prison. At Daniel's sentencing hearing, Judge Rollins, who had presided over the case, delivered a scathing statement. She detailed the calculation and cruelty of the crime, the lives destroyed, the justice system manipulated. She sentenced Daniel to the maximum term allowed by law, 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. "You stole not just money," Judge Rollins said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "You stole years. You stole a mother's peace. You stole a man's freedom, his dignity, his life. There is no punishment sufficient for what you have done, but this court will impose the maximum allowed." Marcus Chén stood at his mother's grave on a quiet morning in October. He had visited every week since his release, telling her about his life, about the truth that had emerged, about his efforts to rebuild what had been destroyed. The state of California had offered him compensation for his wrongful conviction, a calculated amount based on standard rates. It was substantial but could never truly compensate for what had been taken. Marcus accepted it without bitterness. Money was simply a tool, and he had plans for how to use it. With Sarah's help, he established a foundation dedicated to supporting wrongful conviction cases. The Marcus Chén Justice Foundation provided funding for DNA testing, forensic reviews, and legal representation for individuals who maintained their innocence despite conviction. It was his way of transforming his suffering into something constructive. He also worked with the Innocence Project to lobby for reforms in forensic science testimony. The case had revealed deep problems with how expert witnesses were trained, how their testimony was presented, and how juries understood scientific evidence. Marcus became a powerful advocate for change, his story carrying weight that statistics alone never could. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the blood pattern analyst, retired completely from forensic work. She established her own educational foundation, dedicated to training forensic experts about cognitive bias and the limitations of their analyses. She and Marcus met once, a difficult conversation that ended with mutual respect, if not forgiveness. "I will never stop regretting my role in what happened to you," Dr. Morrison said, her voice shaking. "I testified with confidence about things that I should have been more cautious about. I let the prosecution's theory influence my interpretation of the evidence. That's unforgivable." Marcus had thought carefully before agreeing to meet with her. His counselor had warned him that it might be re-traumatizing, but he needed to see her, to understand who she was beyond the courtroom testimony that had sealed his fate. "You're not the villain in this story," Marcus said finally. "Daniel and Jennifer are. You were a piece in their plan, but you didn't create the plan. You're not responsible for their choices." "But I'm responsible for mine," Dr. Morrison replied. "I could have been more careful. I could have acknowledged uncertainty. I could have pushed back when the prosecution asked me to testify with absolute confidence about things that weren't absolute." They parted with an understanding that neither of them had fully healed, but both of them were trying to prevent future harm. It was the best resolution either could hope for. Marcus's adjustment to freedom continued slowly. He underwent intensive therapy, processing the trauma of incarceration and the betrayal that had preceded it. He learned to manage the anxiety that crowded spaces triggered. He developed routines that helped him feel grounded. He also discovered unexpected joys. The first time he went to a movie theater in 16 years, he cried during the previews simply because he could. The first time he ordered food delivery and ate exactly what he wanted, he felt overwhelmed by gratitude. The first time he went for a walk at midnight simply because he could, he understood what freedom actually meant. Sarah introduced him to her world, helped him navigate social media and smartphones and all the technology that had evolved while he was locked away. Marcus found the internet both overwhelming and useful. The same platform that had been used to frame him had ultimately proven his innocence. He was interviewed dozens of times. His story featured on podcasts, documentaries, and news programs. He spoke at law schools and criminal justice conferences. He testified before legislative committees about the need for reform. His voice, quiet but steady, carried moral authority that politicians and lawyers had to acknowledge. 2 years after his release, Marcus attended the graduation ceremony for a young man named Tommy Reeves. Tommy had been exonerated through DNA testing after serving 11 years for a sexual assault he didn't commit. The Marcus Chén Justice Foundation had funded his legal representation during the appeals process. Tommy's mother hugged Marcus after the ceremony, sobbing with gratitude. "You gave me my son back," she said. "You gave him a future." Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, some remaining piece of bitterness finally dissolving. This was why he had survived. This was the purpose that God had preserved him for. Not revenge against those who had wronged him, but service to those who suffered similar wrongs. He thought about Daniel Walsh sitting in federal prison and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction at his imprisonment. Nothing. Daniel had destroyed his own life more thoroughly than he had ever destroyed Marcus's. The years in comfortable isolation in Bolivia had been a prison too, just one without bars, and the years ahead in actual prison would be a just consequence for the choices Daniel had made. Jennifer Chén, he thought of differently. Her testimony had shown genuine remorse, even if that remorse had come too late to prevent harm. She would serve her 12 years, and Marcus hoped she would emerge from that experience genuinely transformed. He hoped she would find a way to make amends, even if those amends could never undo the harm she had caused. Forgiveness, his therapist had explained, was not about absolving others of responsibility. It was about releasing the hold that anger had on his own heart. Marcus worked on forgiveness not because Daniel and Jennifer deserved it, but because he deserved the peace that forgiveness might bring. On the 3rd anniversary of his release, Marcus organized a gathering at his apartment. Sarah came, bringing her husband and their 2 young children. Robert Hayes attended, now fully retired and spending his time as a consultant for defense attorneys handling difficult cases. Linda Martinez from the Innocence Project brought her team. Tommy Reeves came, along with 3 other individuals whom the foundation had helped exonerate. They ate together, shared stories, and celebrated the work they were doing. Marcus looked around the room at these people who had become his family, his purpose, his reason for pushing forward despite the weight of what he had endured. Father Miguel Santos, the missionary who had unknowingly photographed the couple in San Rafael del Monte, had traveled to California specifically for the gathering. He embraced Marcus with tears in his eyes. "I have thought about you every day," Father Miguel said. "I pray for you every morning. God used my simple photograph to bring truth into the light. I will never stop being grateful that I could be an instrument of his justice." Marcus smiled, the expression feeling more natural now than it had 3 years ago. "You saved my life, Father. That photograph was a miracle. I've learned that miracles aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're just a missionary taking a picture at exactly the right moment." They talked late into the evening, sharing food and wine and laughter. Marcus told stories about his mother, keeping her memory alive for the niece and nephew who had never met her. Sarah shared updates about legislative efforts they were supporting, bills that would require better training for forensic experts and clearer standards for expert testimony. Robert Hayes shared his own news. He had been asked to write a book about Marcus's case, a comprehensive examination of what had gone wrong and how similar cases might be prevented. Marcus had given his blessing for the project, hoping it would reach people who needed to understand how easily the justice system could fail. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Marcus stood on his small balcony, looking out at the city lights. San Francisco sparkled in the darkness, beautiful and indifferent to individual human dramas. Somewhere in this city, Daniel Walsh had planned his elaborate deception. Somewhere in this city, Dr. Morrison had prepared testimony that seemed scientifically sound but was actually influenced by cognitive bias. Somewhere in this city, prosecutors had built a case based on assumptions rather than verification. But also somewhere in this city, Sarah had refused to give up on her brother. Robert Hayes had filed the motions that eventually brought the truth to light. Judge Rollins had acted swiftly when new evidence emerged. Journalists had investigated thoroughly rather than accepting the official narrative. The system had failed him catastrophically, but the system had also ultimately corrected itself. It had taken far too long, cost far too much, but truth had emerged. Marcus chose to find hope in that. Sarah joined him on the balcony, bringing him a final glass of wine. They stood in comfortable silence, siblings who had endured an ordeal that most people couldn't imagine. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Do you wish you'd never started that company with Daniel? If you hadn't, none of this would have happened." Marcus considered the question seriously. It was something he had thought about often during the dark years in prison. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret building something I believed in, even though it was stolen from me. I don't regret trusting people even though they betrayed that trust. The alternative would be to live in fear, to never take risks, to never believe in anything or anyone. That's not living at all. You're a better person than I am," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm still angry. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry at what they did to you, to our mother, to all of us." Marcus put his arm around his sister's shoulders. "Your anger kept you searching when everyone else had given up. Your anger drove you to set up those facial recognition alerts, to keep sharing my story online, to refuse to accept the verdict. That anger served a purpose. But now, we get to choose what to do with it going forward." They stood together watching the city, 2 survivors of a trauma that had reshaped their lives irrevocably. Marcus thought about the years lost, about the mother who had died believing her son was a murderer, about the simple pleasures that had been denied to him for 15 years. The grief was real and would probably never completely disappear. But he also thought about Tommy Reeves graduating from college. He thought about the foundation that was helping others fight for their innocence. He thought about the legislative reforms that his case had inspired. He thought about this evening, surrounded by people who cared about justice and about him. Pain and purpose could coexist. Trauma and growth could happen simultaneously. He had learned that the hard way, learned it in a prison cell where every day felt like dying slowly. But he had learned it nonetheless. The city lights glittered like scattered stars, each one representing a life, a story, a human being navigating their own journey through darkness and light. Marcus breathed deeply, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs, and felt grateful simply to be alive, to be free, to have survived. Tomorrow he would return to the Foundation's office, would review new case submissions, would meet with attorneys and journalists and legislators. The work of justice was never finished, never perfect, but always necessary. He had found his calling in the ruins of his destroyed life. But tonight, he would simply stand here with his sister, would feel the wind on his face, would remember that he was no longer Marcus Chén, the convicted murderer, no longer Marcus Chén, the wrongfully imprisoned. He was Marcus Chén, the survivor, the advocate, the proof that truth could emerge even from the deepest darkness. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. I hope this story moved you and made you think about how fragile justice can be, and how important it is to never stop fighting for truth. If you enjoyed this incredible journey, please let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video so you'll never miss another powerful true story like this one. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more content about justice, redemption, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.